Today our topic is communications with the relatives of a patient who is undergoing end of life care. Now, myself working in a cancer hospital, so in our ICU, a lot of time we have patients where the cancer is in very advanced stage. Even though we are providing best possible care for the acute complication, maybe infection, or maybe other complication related to cancer or its therapy, patient is not responding, and the primary team feels, the oncologist feels that we are not able to offer any form of therapy for cancer in future because of the poor general condition. In this situation, all the acute care, all organ supports that we are providing become futile because the final outcome of the patients will be poor, and we are unlikely to provide a good quality of life to him for his rest of the life period. So we'll see how we can address those patients or their relatives in terms of communication, in terms of sharing our idea, our plan, how to provide service to them in next few minutes. So we'll start with a case. A 78-year-old gentleman on diabetic, hypertensive COPD has a stage 4 lung carcinoma and was on immunotherapy. So when suppose someone is on immunotherapy, that means the anticipated complications are less, and at the same time, the response of the therapy will be slow, and there are some associated complications that can happen because of immunotherapy. Now, this patient is admitted with fever, cough, shortness of breath, and diagnosed to have a COVID pneumonia. So what happened? All his therapy related to cancer has been put on hold. He has deteriorated clinically while staying in the COVID ward, requiring intubation and ventilation, and after that developed superadded bacterial infection and treated with broad-spectrum antibiotics. By day 7, there is a clinical deterioration onto the patient after initial response. We cannot wean him off from the ventilator. He was persistently requiring high oxygen. Repeated cultures saying we done an HRCT chest which suggests of a fungal pneumonia. Now this patient already has a lung cancer, superadded COVID, which most likely will have some residual lung damage, so the overall lung reserve become worsened. On the top of that, along with the bacterial infection, he has developed a fungal infection. We added voriconazole and continued our therapy. Now the patient has a very lingering course. Even by the end of 20 days, he is still on ventilator. We cannot wean off this patient, not tolerating even pressure support for long duration. As a result, we could not shift him to a portable BiPAP even after doing a tracheostomy. He's still having intermittent fever, borderline blood pressure, requiring low dose noradrenaline on and off. And whenever we are sending some culture to streamline this antibiotic, we are finding either some MDRO like a carbapenem resistant, colistin resistant, or pan resistant bugs, or some atypical bugs like Serratia, Chrysobacterium, and Elizabeth kingia either from the tracheal spirit or from blood or other samples. Now, if it is from the blood, we are sure that we need to treat it. But whenever we are identifying those bugs from a non-sterile site, like a trachea or a urine, it is very difficult for us to differentiate between colonization and infection. So even after our 25 days, patient status is same. Patient is on ventilator, and patient is having a non-resolving sepsis. So we are continuing with a different regimen of antibiotics with this expectation that she will improve. And along with this, there is a worsening in the renal function. There's an increase in the creatinine. Patient become encephalopathic. We're not sure about the cause. CT MRI has not suggested anything, probably because of sepsis and other metabolic causes, dyslipidemia and all those things. And as there is a progressive cancer, the oncologist thinks that it will be unlikely for him to offer any form of cancer therapy in future. So what will be the next step for us? Now that we have a patient who has a advanced lung cancer and we cannot offer any form of therapy in future, stage 4 disease, along with that COVID pneumonia, superadded bacterial pneumonia, and fungal pneumonia. And after our best possible therapy, we could not wean him off from the ventilator even after 25 to 30 days. And he's stuck on a certain support with progressively worsening on the other functions. So what are the options we have at this point? So one is we can ship the patient to a long-term care facility. This type of long-term care facility is not very common in Indian scenario. It is common in West when patient is dependent on a certain support and they go to a setup when they may require a prolonged ventilation or non-invasive ventilation for an indefinite period and life sustains for a very long duration. We can continue the patient in ICU with advanced organ support, like what we are doing, but it is unlikely that we'll be achieving anything, because whatever the correctable factors we have already tried, but we could not achieve much. Next is, we can discuss with the family member about end of life care. Now we can tell them that we have done enough, we have tried our best, we try to correct all the reversible factors that is possible with our best possible capacity, but patient did not responded, and as a result, I think it is better to continue with the best supportive care rather than going aggressively in terms of organ supports and antibiotics and blood pressure support. We can ask the family to take a decision. That patient is not responding, you decide what you want. That if you say to continue, I will continue. If you say stop, I will stop. Or by doctors, we may try to be a demigod and we decide to de-escalate therapy. We don't discuss with the family member and we decide that we are stopping everything because this patient has not responded with our best possible effort. So what will be your suggestion? You can put your suggestion in the chat box. We wait for 10 seconds and then we'll proceed with our discussion. So the answers what we are getting is basically C or D. That means either we can discuss about the end of life care with the family members, and another option is to ask the family to take a decision. Now we need to understand that family who are tremendously emotionally bound with the patient, it is very difficult to take a call in terms of de-escalation or in terms of stopping the advanced organ support unless we guide them in an appropriate way. We need to tell them that what is the therapy we are offering when we say end of life care, and how we are going to support or help the patient in his terminal period. How is and what will be the anticipated course of the patient when you are going for end of life care. Without explaining all those things to the family, if you just ask them to take a decision, it will be very, very difficult for them, and it will be may not be appropriate to put all responsibility on the shoulder of the family members. And another option which may appear little also practical, at least especially in Indian scenario, that doctor decide to de-escalate therapy. Now it is also not right, because whenever patient is not responding, sometimes we are little biased that we have tried enough and this patient is not working. So what can we do? And we can let's stop the therapy and accept that patient has not responded. As if the treating doctor decide to take a call, obviously there will be biasness. So it is always better not to do that. Discuss this with the family and try to take a joint decision. We'll see how we can do that. I think I can see some hand raised for some question. You can put it in the chat box.
Yes, all questions can be put in the chat box, sir.
Great. So let's continue with this. I think we'll come back again to the chat box. So I'd like to remind everybody about this quote that dying can be a peaceful event, that we all know that we will die eventually, or it can be of a great agony when it is inappropriately sustained by a life support. The most catchy term in this is inappropriately. That means whenever we are providing an organ support or life support, there have to be a underlying reversible factors. Unless the cause of organ support is reversible, it is expected that this patient will require that organ support for a very long duration. And eventually it may not give him a quality of life or a final outcome, good outcome, which we usually anticipate. Now, why we are discussing this in a nursing training? We all know that most of these decisions are taken by the doctors, and they usually discuss this with the family members. They convince them regarding the future plan of therapy, and nursing is just there to implement it. But it is not exactly that scenario, because we all know that whatever the medical decisions or the advices we have put, nursing is the main pillar to implement it. So if saying that just go for best supportive care may be a simple line, but doing that at bedside of the patient, discussing that or sharing those uh, information or ideas with the patient and his family members, and going through the journey with the patient and his family members in this difficult time, is the nurse who is going to do that. So it is very, very important that nursing team act as a bridge between the doctors and the nurse and the patient and the family member in this type of difficult scenario, so that their journey becomes smoothened, they become more comfortable emotionally, and all three of us remain in the same plane. And once we decide regarding plan of therapy, we can implement it smoothly without any confusion, so that patient or family member doesn't feel that their patient has been abandoned in terms of de-escalation or palliative therapy. And also at the same time, they should not feel that even when there is a plan for palliative care, therapy has been escalated and unnecessarily their life or agony of their patient has been prolonged. So in this, that's why the nursing team or the team lead nurse of that unit have to be in liaison with the doctor and the patient family member, and have to have a basic understanding that how we communicate, how we share information, and try to reach to a conclusion in terms of end of life care or palliative care. In this regard, we need to know some terminology and have to understand the inner meaning of that. One is autonomy. Autonomy says right of self-determination. That is the informed patient. Again, the catch term is informed patient. That means before asking the patient to take a call, we need to explain everything to the patient, both pros and cons of that decision. That informed patient has a right to choose the manner of his treatment. So even if there is a treatment A and treatment B is available, though doctor feels that treatment A is better, if after understanding the all pros and cons of both therapy, patient choose the treatment B, we need to accept and respect it as an autonomy to the patient. Next is beneficence. That is the doctor acting in what is or judged to be in patient's interest. So one patient is very, very sick, deteriorating, nearly in the arrest scenario. Doctor feel that for the life saving of the patient, they need to intubate the patient. So we can proceed with that even without a consent, because he is acting for the benefit of the patient with his best possible judgment. This is called beneficence. The physician's expanded goal in terms of beneficence when we are dealing with a palliative patient or end of life care critically ill patient includes facilitating neither hastening nor delaying. That means we should not try to hasten the death or delay the death of a natural dying process, avoiding or reducing the suffering of the patient and his family. See, you need to remember whenever someone is seeing his near and dear one to passing through this very difficult time or at the deathbed, they are going through a tremendous psychological stress along with a financial and other stress, which comes at least in Indian scenario when you are treating patients in a private hospital, and also to providing emotional support and protecting the family from financial ruins. So doing some unnecessary interventions which is unlikely to improve the final outcome of the patient and causing patient's family a lot of money is also not a very logical thing to do. But at the same time, we need to remember that we are not promoting euthanasia. What is euthanasia? It is physician's deliberate and intentional act through administration of a lethal injection or by other means to end the life of a patient. This is not acceptable in Indian scenario. And at the same time, we should not go for paternalistic attitude also. That means when the physician acting unilaterally, that means without taking consent or without having a detailed discussion with the family member or the patient, makes decision for the patient in terms of no further escalation or best supportive care. This is also not a very right thing to do. Another terminology is non-maleficence. That is doing no harm and avoiding the imposition of unnecessary and unacceptable burden on the patients. So suppose one intervention, if I feel that is not going to improve the patient outcome, I can hold it back after proper documentation. And the last is the distributive justice. That means the patient of similar circumstance should receive similar care. That means if I am in a very terminal ill patient, I decide that intubation is not going to help outcome in this patient, probably some of my colleagues also will feel that in this clinical context, intubation is not going to help. That means all the doctors of the similar specialty are on the same page. So in this regard, there is a very good position paper published by Indian Society of Anesthesiology. I will request everybody to go through it. And it is under the leadership of Dr. Mani, who is very intensely working on this topic of end-of-life care, specifically in intensive care scenario, an ICU scenario, when all the organ supports are futile and patient is stuck with either on ventilator or on certain other organ supports. So whenever we are starting a discussion of end-of-life, so there must be a checklist. Why we think that this patient should be considered for end-of-life care? There must be some problem or pathology which is not reversible or not even partly reversible, leading to anticipated very poor quality of life, even if the patient is coming out of this crisis. So like very advanced age coupled with poor comorbid state due to chronic debilitating disease, like COPD, who is requiring home oxygen or a BiPAP, with severe impaired quality of life. That means in maximum he go to the toilet or roam around within the room. Advanced interstitial lung disease with on supplemental oxygen therapy, chronic renal failure requiring long-term dialysis, chronic liver disease, advanced congestive heart failure, who are now in ICU with worsening or acute deterioration. There may be catastrophic illness like organ dysfunction, unresponsive to reasonable period of aggressive therapy, prolonged coma in absence of a brain death. We need to remember that workup for brain death or diagnosis of brain death is very much relevant when we are talking about organ transplant. Otherwise, we'll try to avoid the workup in terms of brain death. Due to acute non-reversible cause of chronic vegetative state, so this the patient is have a prolonged coma and unlikely to recover from it as there is not much correctable factor. Incurable chronic severe neurological state, rendering meaningful life unlikely, like progressive dementia, quadriplegia with ventilator dependency, maybe motor neuron disease. Progressive metastatic cancer where treatment has failed or the patient refuses therapy. This is very commonly I face in my regular practice. Post-cardiac respiratory arrest patients who is not recovering or not improving in his comprehension or CNS function even after a few days. Compatible clinical situation coupled with physician's prediction of low probability of survival, that the patient may have chance unlikely to survive maybe for 2% or 3%, and that's also come at a significant cost, like maybe 1 lakh rupees or 80,000 rupees per day with the maximum possible support. And the family or patient's preference to limit life support or refusal to accept life support. So the first recommendation is a physician has a duty to disclose to the capable patient or family the patient's poor prognosis with honesty and clarity, and when further aggressive support appears to be non-beneficial. As with our regular practice, we understand that when this patient with our best possible support or therapy is unlikely to come out, then the discussion need to be started with the patient. Most likely it is with the family member, because in ICU the patients are sick and not in a situation to be a part of this discussion. The physician should initiate discussion on the treatment option available, including the option of no specific therapy. This is very important. A lot of time we hesitate to tell that in this present clinical condition, there is no specific therapy available to offer. And sometimes it is very difficult for families to accept that even with this progress in the medical specialty, for his patient, there is no specific therapy available. But we need to discuss this and make them understand that we have tried our best and nothing much can be done for this patient. We all are aware of the recent development is advanced directive, studying the patient's preference. It is under process and maybe in next few years it will be more structured and available. Sorry. for our regular practice. And we all know in ICU, less than 5% of the patients, or I would say less than 1% of the patients, are able to communicate with the physicians regarding issues relating to life support. Because most of them will be in sick on ventilator with maximum organ support and unlikely to contribute to this discussion. So what we have to do, we have to identify a suitable family member as surrogate decision maker for the family. When we discuss about the term family, it includes spouse, children, parent, sibling, or if nothing, no one is like of this category is available, it may be a next kin who is available, or even a trusted friend who has taking care of the patient, admitting him to the hospital, and taking all the medical decisions on behalf of it. But we need to remember that in Indian scenario, a hierarchy of surrogates does not exist in making an end-of-life care decision. So if there is a discrepancy in the decision made by the spouse or the children or the parent or the siblings, it is better we discuss and try to put them in the same category, same page. Now, when the fully informed capable patient or family desire to consider palliative care or best supportive care, the physician should offer the available modalities of limiting life-prolonging interventions, which we already have understood that is going to be futile or not helpful. So what are the options? The patient or family should be clearly made aware of the available options for the use of life-sustaining support in their patient. One can be full support, like what we are doing in our ICU. We can continue with the ventilatory support, blood pressure medicines like noradrenaline, antibiotics, sending culture, and chasing all the reports we are available, or chasing or try to deal with all the acute problems that's happening on a recurrent basis. But sometimes we can offer them a do not intubate or do not resuscitate. Like if the patient is a very advanced malignancy that we do occasionally, we think that if the patient go on ventilator, very unlikely that they are going to come out. So we discuss with the family member and they agree that they are not going to give consent for intubation. Sometimes they also suggest that we should not go for a CPR because the patient has a very advanced malignancy. We need to remember that the concept of cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR, all BS and ACLS guidelines are for patients who have an acute deterioration and have a reversible factor. For a patient who is terminally ill on ventilator or an ICU or have a very advanced malignancy or organ failure, these things will be unlikely to help them. Next, two terminology are a little controversial. One is a withholding life support. That means if the patient's blood pressure drops, we will not start any vasopressor. Will the patient require ventilator or require dialysis, we are not going to give that support, organ support. And the fourth is withdrawal of life support. That means if the patient is on ventilator, we'll take him off ventilator and put him on the BiPAP or shift him to the ward. Now, these things we need to be done more cautiously because we don't have a very clear stand in India, an Indian legal system. So this have to be done very cautiously as per the hospital policy. And finally, we to offer him to the palliative care who we know that has a very advanced malignancy, and if there is an acute deterioration, should not be shifted to critical care unit for advanced organ support, and they better to be managed in ward with the care of the palliative team. We need to remember that in India, euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide are illegal. The physician also must discuss the implication of foregoing aggressive interventions through formal conference with the capable patient or his family and work towards a shared decision-making process. Now, when we are saying we are not going to provide or not going to go for advanced organ support like intubation and ventilation, we need to explain them that that means that patient will eventually deteriorate even with after best possible supportive care, and we can there's a good possibility that he or she may die. So unless we explain that anticipated journey because of that withholding of that organ support, it will be very difficult for the family member to cope up with this situation. So the patient will gradually progressively deteriorate, saturation may drop, blood pressure may fall. Now, unless they anticipate or they have been explained properly or they are mentally prepared to face this of the consequence, they may not accept it, and in the crisis scenario, they suddenly may ask for everything, which is not very uncommon even in our regular practice. So he accepts the patient's autonomy or the patient's family member's decision in making an informed consent while fulfilling his or her obligation to provide beneficent care. So that means that the decision of no further escalation or end of life care need to be shared between the patient and the doctor, or the family member of the patient and the doctor, and we have to come to a reasonable consensus. The correlates of effective communication and family satisfaction in this regard includes provision of adequate time. So we cannot expect that just within one discussion, family member can take such a difficult decision for their near and dear one. It needs to be frequent and consistent information provided by a preferably a single contact person. Because once with that discussion, they become more closely associated with them, they start relating with them. They feel that this is also a part of their family member, and they are also suggesting or taking decisions in the best of for the best of the patient and also for their family. For ICU patients, preferably it should be an intensivist along with the nursing staffs available, because they are spending a significant amount, a proportion of their time with the patient and their family. And also there must be an adequacy of physician and nursing staff and availability to help the patient and the family member in presence of their family physician. So because of this decision is very much difficult for the family, this discussion need to be done repeatedly in presence of all the stakeholders. But one person needs to lead the whole discussion, and preferably it would be the intensivist in patients who are in ICU. I need to ensure that enough time for the family to ask questions and express themselves further enhance the family satisfaction. That means if they have a doubt, if they have a query, if they need to discuss with the other family members, they should be allowed or give adequate time so that they can close those loops, discuss among themselves, and finally take a rational call. The pending conscientious decision or on the event of conflict between the physician's recommendation and the family's wishes, all existing supportive intervention should be continued. So unless the family able to take a call, it is not a good idea to de-escalate by themselves, as we already discussed. It has to be a shared decision. But the physician is, however, is not morally obliged to institute new therapy against his or her better clinical judgment. That means if the patient is terminally ill on 2 or 3 inotrope, it is vasopressor. If there is a renal failure, physician may decide that this patient is unlikely to be helpful with a dialysis. And with this judgment, he may not offer a dialysis to this patient and his family member. So as I discussed, though we need to respect the patient's autonomy and the medical practitioner's clinical decision, the best option for the patient is a shared decision model. When we take the input from the patient, or most practically from the patient's family member, patient scheme, and we share our medical inputs, our understanding or anticipated outcome from our experience or knowledge to them, and try to take a shared decision, try to reach a consensus that can be best for the patient and also for the family. Then the discussion which leading up to the decision to withhold life-sustaining therapies should be clearly documented in a case record to ensure transparency and to avoid future misunderstanding. Such documentation should mention the person who participated in the decision-making process and the treatment withheld or withdrawn. We need to remember that all these discussions are happening in a patient when the doctor himself feels that all these organ supports are unlikely to help, unlikely to improve outcome. It's not like that just because family members are coming and suggesting us we are de-escalating therapy, we are stopping certain therapy. It is not exactly like that. So whenever we are withholding certain therapy in this type of patient, we need to document it in a paper, in a system, in a clear manner. We need to explain the pros and cons, explain our discussion with the family member and how they feel about it, and close it with a signature from our side. Though the family member's signature is not mandatory, a lot of time they refuse to sign because they find it is it's emotional burden for them. But it is preferable to take a signature so that they understood and accept or imbibe the whole thing into them. But it is not mandatory. Even if the doctors or the nursing documents it and sign it, it is good enough. But the overall responsibility for the decision rests with the attending physician and the intensivist to the patient, who must ensure that all members of the caregiver team, including the medical and the nursing staff, agrees with and following the same approach to the care of the patient. This is very, very important, And that's why we are discussing this in a nursing forum. So we discuss with the family member in terms of palliative care, no further therapy or no further escalation of therapy. Then suddenly they found that patient blood pressure has dropped and the nursing staff was not aware of the decision or the plan of the therapy, and suddenly staff in ordinary. And once the family members see, they become upset that we find with great difficulty, we take a call of no further escalation. Now with these supports, you are prolonging the agony, prolonging the life of my patients, and putting us through the difficult time for a longer duration. So the burden of decision should not be put only upon the family member, as several studies have found that surrogates wanting in decision-making capabilities of the patient. That means family members do not like to take the call alone. So it is always better if we guide them in terms of anticipated outcome, in terms of our medical perspective. The leadership role assumed by an intensivist, which is experience and expertise, generates trust and confidence to the family. So when we admit that with our best possible capability, we tried to recover their patient, but even with that, we have not successful because of these reasons, and these are mostly irreversible. So they understand that they have tried their best and patient is not responding. Physicians or the intensivists should minimize inconsistencies between the members of the treating team. That means, suppose the patient, for my hospital, the patients are admitted under medical oncology. Suppose I discuss with the family member in terms of end of life care or palliative care, but I fail to keep my primary consultant in the loop. And suddenly he comes for the round and he talk about the family that once the patient is out of ICU, I will give him a chemotherapy and the anticipated outcome will be another 6 months. Now it gives a very wrong impression to the family. That means that treating members of the treating team are not on the same page. On one hand, I am suggesting for end of life care, and the other hand, the primary consultant is suggesting for a chemotherapy or a surgery or some other therapy, which can give patient another 6 months of their life. So this is absolutely not desirable. So whenever we are planning for certain therapy, it is better that the treating doctors, like the intensivist, like the medical oncologist for my patient, maybe a neurologist in case of head trauma, with the senior nursing staffs in that area, sit down together, discuss that what are the therapies they are offering to the patients. Once they have a clear idea, only then they should share this with the family members. If the capable patients of the family consistently desire to continue life support to be withdrawn, in situations in which the physician considers aggressive treatment is non-beneficial, the treating team is ethically bound to consider withdrawal within the limit of existing law. That means the patient's family members, next kins, and the doctors both are on the same page. They understand that it is unlikely to improve an outcome, even if you consider the best possible medical support and organ support. So now it is responsibility of the doctors to guide them ethically to how we can proceed for the end of life care within the limit of existing law. So we need to be sure what is the land of the law and what it allows for us to do in our medical practice. So in this, Indian law doesn't have a clear stand on end of life care issues, except for declaring euthanasia as a punishable offense. So euthanasia is not acceptable. Withdrawal, even with an express consent of the patient or next to kin, can be misinterpreted post-op. So as we don't have a very clear understanding, a clear law in terms of withdrawal or withholding organ support, this needs to be done very cautiously after a detailed discussion with the family member, detailed discussion with the other doctors of your team who are not directly involved in the patient care or as per the hospital's policy. But it needs to be done very judiciously after documenting everything, so that tomorrow there should not be a medical legal issue. For that, we need to have a very clear understanding on the law of the land. And in the event of withdrawal or withholding organ support, it is a physician's obligation to provide compassionate and effective palliative care to the patient, as well as to attend the emotional need of the family. That means, so whenever we are deciding that we will go for supportive care, we are not going to offer advanced organ therapy, patient's family should not feel that we are abandoning their patient, that there is nothing much can be done, so patient can be left alone or left unattended. In this situation, the role of nursing is very, very important. Even when the patient's intent of therapy is palliative, our emotional side, our ethical responsibility to support those patients in terms of giving comfort, giving relieving pain, try to relieve the respiratory distress with the oxygen or a BiPAP or whatever should be done, and it should be very obvious to the patients. Otherwise, the family will become very emotionally upset that at the terminal time when the patients are sick and on the deathbed, no one is bothered about the patient. It should not happen. And we need to optimize our dose of opioids so that patient does not feel the distress or the pain, and the passage from this world to the next world should be very comfortable for the patient. As we know that we cannot cure everybody, but we need to care for everybody. This is very important. So this is the pathway that we have discussed, that physician's objective and subject. After the physician's objective and subjective assessment, they need to discuss this with the family member in honesty, accuracy, and early disclosure. That means we will not start our discussion at after 25 days of the patient on ventilator, like my previous case. It needs to be discussed after 4 or 5 days when you're anticipating a prolonged course with a poor outcome. Early offer of palliative treatment is important when the final outcome is anticipated to be poor. Conscientious to an open and early repetitive discussion. If the family members are not convinced, it is better to take a second opinion, involve another doctor who is not directly involved in the patient care and who doesn't have a direct stake, so that he can give a unbiased opinion regarding this claim. If there is a conflict between the patient's family member and the doctors, which is not very unlikely or not very uncommon, so we need to involve the other people, like social, as we mentioned, social, maybe a second opinion, another doctor, psychologist, social worker, maybe depending on the religious belief, we may allow their guide, priest or religious gurus to have or do the terminal rituals. Those things give psychological comfort to the patient. There's no that patient is not going to survive. It is better to take care of the emotional side of the family members. Is very important. Okay, we'll have to go through another case. It is little different from the previous one. So it's a 20-year one. So before that, I think I will look at if we have a question in the chat box. Now, this is a very difficult question from Mr. Tarannum Sheikh, that religious belief and everything is important, but it is not beyond law. We all know that in COVID world, it is very difficult to allow the family members inside, and it is nearly impossible to do the standard rituals. But we have to be very compassionate about our patients and their religious belief, and also about the emotions of the family member. And we should try to do as much as we can. So if maybe once the patient's body is removed from the COVID ward and going to under the control of the government authority, if they want to be with the patient 1 minute, they may want, if they want to do a prayer, if they do some religious belief, religious technique or anything, we can try to allow it without compromising the law, without compromising the safety of the staff, safety of the family members. Great. We don't have any other questions, so we go to the next case. So it's a 20-year-old gentleman, student with no comorbidity, complain of sudden gum bleeding for 20 days, not resolving with symptomatic management, headache for 7 to 10 days. Now come to the emergency with acute onset worsening of the headache, altered sensorium, had a generalized tonic-clonic seizure, got intubated and ventilated and shifted to ICU. On day 1, this patient, because of GTCS, he received sedative drugs like lorazepam, followed by infusion of midazolam. He developed bradycardia and hypertension. We did a CT brain that shows significant left parenchymal bleed with intraventricular extension. Clinical evidence of raised ICP was there. Along with that, we do an optic nerve sheath diameter with an ultrasound that shows a value of 0.61 and 0.60 centimeter, which shows significant increase in the intracerebral pressure. So we give 3% NaCl infusion and start monitoring the bispectral index to suppress the burst of pressure, so that there should not be an ongoing seizure, non-convulsive status. But on day 2, what we find that pupil is dilated and fixed, no light reflex, no corneal reflex, no doll side reflex. GCS is 2T, no cuff reflex, but still he was triggering ventilator. BIS was 28, so we stopped all sedation. Patient started developing polyuria with increase in sodium, so we stopped sodium chloride, NaCl 3% NaCl. We hydrate the patient optimally with balanced salt and we give desmopressin. So this indicates that patient's brain function has deteriorated significantly and with a very minimum CNS function is still present. On day 3, patient was not even triggering the ventilator. Polyuria settled with therapy. Patient is developing shock or noradrenaline. Patient has a sinus tachycardia. Now with decrease in the ventilatory stuff, he start retaining CO2 also, carbon dioxide also. That means he's not even tried to initiate the breathing. His brain is not able to sense the increase in the carbon dioxide. So what can be done next? This is again a chat box question. Please answer in the chat box that what we're going to do next. It can be a multiple answer also. Should we continue with organ support, whatever we are doing? See, in last patient, we take a call after 25 days. This is only day 3 or day 4. Should we take such a difficult decision so early? Should we do an EEG? Should we start workup for brain dead? Or wait or monitor the GCS for next few days and keep all sedations off? Or should we counsel the family member that there is unlikely to have any outcome? We'll wait for 15-20 seconds. EEG, okay. Yes, we need to do an EEG to look at the underlying cerebral function, but may not be immediately because we have already given him benzodiazepine. So the effects may be there for some long duration. So we need to do all those workups after 72 hours of stoppage of all sedation. Yes, I think the most appropriate will be to monitor the patients and keep them off sedation for at least 72 hours. If the patient's GCS is still poor and the patients, even after 72 hours of stopping all sedations, all the other factors of poor sensorium like metabolic causes, electrolytes, hypothermia, sepsis, everything has been taken care of properly. And even the patient's GCS is poor, no cerebral function, no Dolce, no pupillary reflex, then probably we should start workup for the poor sensoria. But again, we need to remember, whenever we are working up for a brain dead, its intention is for organ donation. Now, in this patient, has an underlying hematological malignancy, as I've given some hint in the first slide. So this patient is not an ideal case for organ donation. In that situation, should we work up for a brain dead? Do you need a workup to ensure that it's a brain dead? Is not likely, is not needed. Even with a poor GCS after 72 hours, that patient is a poor GCS, we can start discussing with the family members in terms of absolutely poor outcome. And here, then the term of medical futility will come. So it's a clinical situation where in absence of brain death, if the patient is brain dead, then there is no further discussion that the patient is dead already. And we can take the organ support, take off the organ support. But if the patient is not brain dead, or we have not done the workup, if the physician believes that the continuing life support is futile, and it may be justifiable to take a unilateral decision to limit life supporting interventions for the patient. This is called medical futility. Medical futility may be a quantitative. How low are the odds of success? For this patient, our success rate may be 0.5 or 1%, maybe 0% to be honest with you. But it can be qualitative. That is, what are the desired aim? So what we are expecting from this patient? What is the family member's expectation? At least he will be awake, trying to obey command, try to do his basic things of the regular life. Can he do that? It's very, very, very unlikely. But again, these are medical terminology. Whenever you are applying it in your practice, it has to be done very judiciously according to the law of the land. So what are the examples when the physician may consider unilateral action, but we have already decided we are not suggesting for unilateral action. It has to be a shared responsibility with the family in terms of end of life care. When the patient have a prognosis of imminent death, like this patient having metastatic cancer when treatment has failed or has been declined, very elderly with a dementia with baseline function is very poor, and the patient has a chronic vegetative state with organ dysfunction. In this situation, we can consider them to have become a medically futile or very poor, without any outcome. The proposed action is seeking a second opinion from another physician, not here to involve in the care of the patient. So he will give an unbiased opinion, and that can be done in presence of the family member. Multiple counseling sessions with the family, informing the family about the hopeless prognosis of the patient and the futility of continuing the life support. As I already mentioned, you cannot expect that they will take a call within one session or two sessions. We have to give them enough time so that they can ask all their queries, all their doubts, and they should be absolutely clear in their head that we have tried enough and there is literally no outcome for their patient. With the help of the hospital administration, we can set up a committee of doctors and also the nursing staff and social workers to counsel the family. The committee may take the help of a social worker, psychologist, or priest, or depending on the local rituals, local religion, to help overcome the barrier of understanding. And if the family remain inflexible, then suggesting transfer to another treating team that is willing to continue the support, because sometimes it may come as a medical legal case that in such a futile patient, you have continued therapy or organ support for a longer duration, leading to an increase or significantly increased financial burden to the patient. Sometimes maybe daughter may suggest or husband may suggest, and another family member may put a case in later on. So if their family is forcing us to continue organ support or ICU care in a futile patient, it needs to be documented properly, and better to suggest them to take to another setup or another doctor who agrees to continue this care. And as I already discussed, in this patient, if this is a case of for brain death organ donation, then only we'll work up for the brain death. They have to demonstrate a coma without any brain stem reflex and apnea. So we have already worked that patient has a general GCS of 2T, not responding to painful stimulus, pupil dilated fixed, no other corneal oculocephalic reflexes, no facial movement with painful stimulus, no cuff reflex, no gag reflex, and no brain-mediated motor response. And when you do an apnea test, patients retain CO2 with drop in pH without triggering the ventilator. Now, if you want to confirm a brain dead, then probably you have to take that different country has a different law. In Indian scenario, you have to do a ancillary test. Probably you have to do an electrophysiological stent or EEG to see that there is baseline flattening. There is no electrical activity in the brain. So by this, I'd like to conclude my session with these final words that this is a very tricky communication whenever we are discussing with the family member in terms of end of life care or palliative care. We need to do that with empathy, with this understanding that they are the next kin to the family. It is very, very difficult for them to accept the fact that there is nothing more can be done for their patient, and they have to see their patients dying gradually in front of their eyes. But we have to make them understand that death is an imminent thing. We all have to die someday, but it should be a dignified death. It is not desirable that a futile patient die when he was on ventilator or in ICU in a closed room, far away from the eyes of the family member. Rather than if that patient may prefer to die in his own bed among his family member in a happy state of mind. By this, I'm concluding my presentation, and I think I'm open for discussion.
So you can stop sharing the screen here. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Sudipto. Thank you for this elaborating lecture and very informative. And in the chat box, there is a 5 question. Achha. These all are answer of your questions actually.
Yes.
So you can.
Someone can raise a hand so that we can ask them some question. I can take their question.
Yeah.
If anyone want to ask a question, please raise your hand.
Actually, no. তো 7টায় যাওয়ার। আচ্ছা 5 minutes. I think your lecture is so elaborating, there is no question at all. Good. No, this is a good lecture. It's very informative.
This is a very, very important topic, and that we face on a regular practice. And as I mentioned, that law is not very clear. It's clear
Yes.
about euthanasia is not allowed, doctor supported death is not allowed. But what about withholding organ support, withholding or withdrawing support? More practically for withdrawing support, who is stuck on ventilator. The law
And
is
that is
not
the
very
most
clear.
neglected part in any course like MBBS or MD, and also in the nursing also. It is so vital things, and in at least in our during post graduation or during the undergraduation, it has been not enlightened that much. But in
Right.
practical, in practice, it is very much required.
It's very important that nursing remains in the same page with the doctor so that whatever we decide in terms of therapy, in terms of supportive care, or in terms of withholding support or withdrawing support, that we provide without any break, so that there should not be a miscommunication between the families and the doctor and the treating team, that their doctors don't know what they are doing, nursing staff don't know what doctor has suggested, and it causes a lot of confusion. Because in this scenario, even though family take a call, trust me, they are not in a very good state of mind. Now sometimes if they find there is a discrepancy between the discussion and the intervention, they become really upset, and that can break the smoothness or the smoothness or the of the journey, which is not at all desirable.
Yeah, there are one question has come in the chat box that what is the legal aspect of withdrawal life support?
No, regarding withdrawal of life support, there is no legal stand till now. So that it is not legally acceptable, neither legally unacceptable. What law says that euthanasia is not acceptable. That means you cannot give a medicine to a patient so that his death has fastened, or you cannot help a patient to die. That is not legally acceptable. That is under punishment. So we cannot help a patient to suicide. So this is not acceptable. Okay, these two things. But whether the withdrawal or support, life support or withholding life support is acceptable or not, it is not very clear in Indian scenario. So in Indian law. But what is gradually coming is that informed consent, that when the patient can decide that they will not going to give consent for intubation, they can do that, or CPR or ventilation. They can give that beforehand within a proper way. That process is under work. So probably Dr. As I mentioned, Dr. Mani is actively working on that with his team. So eventually I think we can get a more clarity on this. But till now, there is not a very clear legal stand in terms of withdrawal of life support or withholding life support. So whatever you are doing in your hospital, it have to be as per the hospital policy, and also in collaboration with the patient's family member, and also with the treating doctors, so that everybody remains on the same page in terms of management. That's why I mentioned about shared decision making, rather than taking the decision only by the doctors or putting the whole responsibility on the family. Both is not desirable.